How did Viking sailors survive freezing seas when open flames could burn their ships, betray their position, or kill everyone aboard? The answer begins not with a single trick or hidden technology, but with a way of thinking shaped by centuries of cold, wind, and water. To the Vikings, heat was not something you produced and protected with walls and chimneys. It was something you trapped, shared, conserved, and generated through motion. Their ships were never meant to be warm in the way a house is warm. They were meant to keep men alive long enough to cross oceans that most of the medieval world believed were uncrossable. In that sense, Viking ships were not floating homes but survival machines, designed to work with the human body rather than against the sea. The longship itself was the first layer of warmth. Built with overlapping clinker planks, the hull flexed with waves instead of fighting them. This flexibility reduced the constant shock of icy water striking rigid wood, which would otherwise suck heat away from the crew through vibration and spray. The wood absorbed some cold, but it also retained a measure of warmth once exposed to bodies and breath. Tar, animal fat, and resin sealed the planks, keeping water out and preventing evaporative cooling that could drain heat faster than air alone. A dry ship was not a comfortable ship, but it was a survivable one. Inside this narrow hull, space was intentionally limited. There was no room to spread out, no private corners, no wasted air. Men sat shoulder to shoulder along the benches, knees nearly touching the ribs of the ship, bodies pressed close as waves lifted and dropped them in unison. This closeness was not incidental. Human bodies generate heat continuously, and when packed together, that heat accumulates. The crew became a living furnace, each man both producing warmth and receiving it from those beside him. In freezing conditions, isolation was deadly, proximity was protection. Clothing did far more work than any fire ever could. Viking sailors wore layered garments designed not for beauty, but for thermal control. Closest to the skin were woolen tunics and trousers. Wool was essential because it retained insulating properties even when damp, unlike linen or leather alone. Over this came thicker wool cloaks, often treated with oils or fats to shed water. Animal skins were added in extreme cold, with fur turned inward to trap warm air. These layers did not stop the cold outright, but they slowed the loss of body heat enough to keep muscles functioning. Feet and hands were protected with special care. Cold extremities meant lost grip on oars, rigging, and weapons. Woolen socks, leather shoes packed with dried grass or straw, and wrapped footcloths created pockets of air that reduced heat loss. Mittens, often made from hide or thick wool, kept fingers together rather than separated, conserving warmth. The goal was never comfort, it was circulation. As long as blood flowed, life continued. Movement was another source of heat, and rowing was the most reliable. Long voyages alternated between sailing and rowing depending on wind, but in cold, still conditions, oars were more than propulsion. Rowing worked large muscle groups, generating internal heat that spread through the body. Sweat was dangerous if allowed to linger, so experienced sailors regulated effort carefully, rowing in rhythms that warmed without soaking clothing. A tired man could be a warm man, but an exhausted, wet man was close to death. When the sail was raised, it too played a role in thermal survival. Woolen sails, heavy and dense, blocked wind when properly angled. They acted as moving walls, redirecting freezing air over and around the ship rather than directly into the crew. When reefed or lowered, sails could be partially wrapped or positioned to create crude wind breaks. Shields hung along the gunwales served a similar function, breaking wind and deflecting spray. These shields were not decorative. They were part of the ship's environmental design. Fire, when used at all, was never open and never routine. On land, Vikings heated stones in controlled fires, then carried those stones aboard wrapped in cloth or placed in wooden containers. These hot stones radiated gentle warmth for hours without flame, smoke, or sparks. The heat was localized and limited, used to warm hands, dry clothing, or prevent freezing during rest. This practice was dangerous if mishandled, but skilled crews understood its limits. Heat was borrowed briefly, not indulged. Food played an invisible but vital role. High-fat diets were not a luxury but a necessity. Dried fish, smoked meat, and fermented products provided dense calories that fueled internal heat production. Eating before cold watches or long rowing stretches was strategic. A fed body burns warmer than a hungry one. Warmth, in this sense, came from within, not from the ship. Sleep, when possible, was another challenge. There were no bunks, no enclosed cabins for most of the crew. Men slept where they sat, wrapped in cloaks, leaning against each other or the ship's ribs. Shared body heat was essential. Those on watch endured the worst cold, while those resting conserved warmth. Rotations were planned not just for navigation, but for survival. No one was exposed too long, because the cold punished the careless quickly and without mercy. Perhaps most important was knowledge. Viking sailors understood cold the way desert peoples understand heat. They recognized early signs of dangerous exposure, numbness, confusion, clumsiness. A man showing these signs was moved, worked, fed, or warmed by others before he became a liability or a corpse. Survival was communal. Individual toughness meant nothing without collective discipline. The ship itself offered no illusion of safety. It was open, wet, and exposed, yet perfectly suited to its purpose. Instead of fighting the environment with fire and walls, Viking sailors adapted their bodies, clothing, movement, and social structure to the cold. Heat was never centralized. It was distributed. Every man was both a source and a recipient of warmth, bound together by necessity as tightly as the planks of the hull. This approach allowed Viking ships to cross the North Sea, reach Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, where icy spray froze on beards and ropes stiffened like iron. They did not conquer the cold, they endured it, and endurance, refined over generations, became their greatest maritime technology, one that would be tested even more brutally as voyages grew longer, seas rougher, and survival depended not just on staying warm, but on staying alive when warmth itself became a scarce resource. The question of warmth aboard Viking ships becomes even more revealing when voyages stretched beyond familiar coasts and into weeks of open ocean, where cold was no longer an inconvenience, but a constant threat that shaped every decision. By the time a longship left sight of land, the crew had already accepted that comfort was impossible. What mattered was balance between heat and moisture, effort and rest, exposure and shelter. The men who survived these journeys were not stronger than others by nature. They were trained by culture to manage cold as a living force that demanded respect. One of the most critical elements was moisture control. Cold alone could be endured, but cold combined with wetness was lethal. Sea spray constantly soaked the ship, and rain or snow offered no mercy. Viking sailors understood that staying completely dry was unrealistic, so they focused on staying dry enough. Cloaks were shaken out whenever possible. Clothing was wrung, aired, and rotated between layers to prevent one garment from becoming saturated. Even in freezing winds, brief exposure of damp cloth to air could reduce moisture and slow heat loss. These acts were small, repetitive, and essential, forming part of a daily rhythm that kept bodies functional. The hull itself was managed carefully to reduce water accumulation. Bilge water was a silent enemy, chilling feet and legs through prolonged contact. Crews bailed frequently, even when exhaustion pressed hard. Wooden gratings or loose planks were sometimes laid on the bottom of the ship to lift feet above standing water. This slight separation made a significant difference, reducing conductive heat loss and preventing frost-numbed limbs. A man who could feel his feet could still work. A man who could not was already in danger. Wind was another adversary that had to be negotiated rather than resisted. The open design of longships allowed cold air to sweep through, but experienced sailors learned how to angle the ship relative to wind and waves to minimize exposure. When possible, the bow was kept into the wind to reduce spray washing across the benches. In following seas, adjustments were made to prevent wind from cutting sideways through the crew. These subtle changes did not eliminate cold, but they reduced its intensity, buying time and energy. Sails and rigging were not passive tools. They were part of the thermal strategy. Woolen sails, heavy and textured, absorbed moisture, but also blocked wind. When furled or partially lowered, they could be positioned to shield the crew from the worst gusts. Ropes stiffened by ice were handled carefully, often warmed briefly by hands or breath before being worked, preventing cracking or loss of grip. Even the act of maintaining the rigging, tightening, adjusting, monitoring, kept sailors moving, generating warmth through constant low-level activity. Psychology played a crucial role. Cold breaks morale long before it breaks the body. Viking culture placed immense value on endurance and shared hardship. Songs, chants, and spoken stories were not just entertainment. They were tools to maintain focus and coordination. A distracted mind succumbs to cold faster than an engaged one. Keeping rhythm while rowing, maintaining watch rotations, and reinforcing group identity helped prevent the mental fatigue that leads to careless mistakes in freezing conditions. Breathing itself became a controlled act. In extreme cold, rapid breathing can increase heat loss, as warm air is expelled and replaced by freezing wind. Sailors learned to regulate breath during exertion, avoiding panic and conserving warmth. Beards, often worn thick, trapped moisture from breath, forming icy masks that paradoxically provided a thin layer of insulation over the face. What appeared harsh and primitive was, in practice, an adaptation shaped by experience. When storm struck, the challenge intensified. Waves crashed over the gunwales, soaking everything in. Moments. In these conditions, survival depended on prioritization. Steering and balance came first. Warmth came second. A capsized ship meant death for all, regardless of temperature. Yet even here, knowledge of cold guided action. After heavy spray, crews worked together to restore some measure of dryness, rearranging cloaks, sharing warmer garments, and positioning bodies to block wind for the weakest among them. Children, elders, or less experienced men were often placed where exposure was slightly reduced, not out of kindness alone, but practicality. A weakened crew member endangered everyone. This pragmatic compassion was a hallmark of Viking seamanship. Survival was not individual heroism, but collective responsibility. The strongest protected the vulnerable because the vulnerable preserved the group's integrity. Night amplified every hardship. Darkness removed visual cues, making navigation and coordination harder. Temperatures dropped further, and the absence of sunlight erased any illusion of warmth. Watches were shortened and movement was encouraged to prevent freezing stiffness. Men stamped their feet, shifted weight, and flexed muscles continuously. Stillness was avoided. Sleep, when allowed, was shallow and brief, more a state of rest than true slumber. There was also an understanding of limits. Viking sailors did not sail blindly into winter storms without reason. Seasonal knowledge guided voyages, with departures timed to avoid the worst cold when possible. Yet exploration and necessity sometimes overrode caution. In those moments, survival techniques were pushed to their extremes, revealing just how finely balanced life aboard these ships truly was. The absence of fire forced innovation in every other area. Heat had to be produced internally, conserved externally, and shared socially. This created a system where every action served multiple purposes. Rowing moved the ship and warmed the body. Clothing protected against cold and communicated. Status and readiness. Songs kept spirits high and synchronized physical effort. Even suffering had structure, channeled into routines that kept chaos at bay. By the time a longship approached distant shores, whether the rocky coasts of Iceland or the icy fringes of Greenland, the crew bore the marks of this struggle. Faces were weathered, hands cracked, and clothing stiff with salt. Yet they arrived alive, capable of unloading cargo, building shelters, and continuing their journey. This endurance was not accidental. It was the result of a culture that treated cold not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a condition to be managed with discipline, knowledge, and shared resolve. As voyages grew longer and ambitions expanded, these methods would be tested against even harsher environments, where survival demanded more than endurance alone. In those regions, the line between life and death narrowed further, and the strategies that kept Viking ships warm enough would determine whether entire settlements thrived or vanished into the ice. By the time Viking ships pressed into the coldest reaches of the North Atlantic, survival had become an exact science shaped by failure as much as success. Every man aboard understood that warmth was no longer a matter of comfort, but of timing, judgment, and restraint. The techniques that had worked in coastal waters were refined, intensified, and sometimes pushed to their limits as ice appeared on the horizon and the sea itself seemed to harden beneath the hull. In these extreme regions, the ship was treated almost like a living body. Its condition was constantly monitored, because even small changes could affect thermal survival. Ice buildup on the hull increased drag and slowed progress, prolonging exposure to cold. Crews chipped ice away with tools, even as freezing spray replaced what they removed. This labor was exhausting, but it generated vital heat and kept the ship moving. A stalled vessel in icy seas was a death sentence. Ropes, oars, and rigging were managed with obsessive care. Wood becomes brittle in severe cold, and a snapped oar or frozen line could cripple the ship. Sailors warmed critical components with their hands, breath, or shared body heat before putting them under strain. Tools were kept close to the body when not in use, preventing them from freezing solid. Nothing was left exposed unnecessarily. The discipline required for this constant attention was learned over years, passed from experienced sailors to younger men through demonstration rather than instruction. The human body remained the primary source of heat, but it also became increasingly fragile. Prolonged cold drains energy reserves rapidly, so rationing was adjusted as conditions worsened. High-fat foods were prioritized, and eating became a scheduled act tied to work cycles. Warmth followed nourishment, and nourishment followed effort. This cycle was deliberate. Breaking it risked weakness, confusion, and eventual collapse. Mental clarity was guarded just as fiercely as physical heat. Cold dulls judgment, making simple tasks dangerous. Viking crews relied on routines to counter this effect. Tasks were performed in familiar sequences, reducing the need for complex decision-making. Roles were clearly defined, and commands were concise. There was no room for hesitation or debate when hands were numb and winds howled. Structure preserved life where improvisation could cost it. Social bonds tightened under these conditions. The shared struggle against cold erased many differences of status aboard ship. A man who could row, bail, or steer was valuable regardless of wealth or reputation on land. This temporary equality strengthened cooperation, ensuring that no one was abandoned to the cold unless survival of the whole demanded it. Even then, such choices were rare and weighed heavily, reflecting a deep understanding that morale was as essential as muscle. When landfall was made in icy regions, the ship's role in warmth did not end. Longships were often pulled ashore and repurposed as shelters. Sails became roofs, hulls blocked wind, and the ship's structure created a micro-environment that reduced heat loss. Fires could then be used safely on land, but the habits formed at sea persisted. Heat was still conserved, shared, and respected. The sea had taught its lessons well. These practices had long-term consequences. They enabled not just voyages, but settlement. Greenland, in particular, demanded extreme thermal discipline. Although eventual climate shifts would doom these colonies, their initial survival owed much to the techniques developed aboard ships. The ability to endure cold without reliance on fire allowed Vikings to explore and exploit regions beyond the reach of many contemporaries. Archaeological evidence supports this picture of cold-adapted seamanship. Wear patterns on ships, residues of tar and fat, and the construction of sails all point to deliberate choices aimed at managing exposure. Written sources, sparse though they are, hint at voyages defined by endurance rather than comfort. Sagas speak of suffering and hardship as expected companions of travel, not extraordinary trials. This normalization of cold was itself a survival strategy. Comparing Viking methods to later maritime traditions highlights their uniqueness. Many medieval and early modern ships relied heavily on enclosed spaces and onboard fires, which limited their use in extreme cold and increased risks at sea. Viking ships, by contrast, accepted exposure as unavoidable and built survival around it. This made them flexible, fast, and capable of operating in environments where heavier vessels struggled. Ultimately, the question of how Vikings heated their ships has a simple answer and a complex meaning. They did not heat them in the way modern minds expect. There were no furnaces, no hearths, no constant flames. Instead, there was a system of human warmth, intelligent design, disciplined behavior, and cultural adaptation. Heat was generated by muscles, preserved by clothing, protected by structure, and multiplied through cooperation. This approach reveals something deeper about Viking society. Survival was communal. Knowledge was practical and transmitted through experience. Technology was not separate from the body, but an extension of it. The ship did not shield sailors from the world. It forced them to engage with it intelligently and relentlessly. In the end, Viking ships crossed icy seas not because they were warm, but because they were survivable. They carried men who understood cold as a constant companion, not an obstacle to be removed. That understanding, earned through generations of hardship, allowed these open vessels to travel farther north and west than most of their age could imagine, leaving a legacy carved not in comfort, but in endurance.